Okay, take three. Yes, this is the third time I'm going to try to read through this. Um, I decided I wanted to share this on my channel. This is an article that I wrote on my blog in October of 2017 about the first time I played the game D&D. I wrote this article because I wanted to have this all written down because of the experience I had with this game, and I felt I needed to put it down in writing, and I'm really, really glad I did. I've shared it on some sites a couple times in the past on D&D sites on Facebook and stuff. I hope you enjoy listening to it. It is a little bit it's a little long, and I'll try to get through it quickly, but I don't want to rush either. So we'll see. I'll see if I can get through this. Um, I've got my water here, so hopefully this will work this time. Okay. The first time I played Dungeons and Dragons, I remember it well. The year was 1980. It was my freshman year in college, and my roommate said he's going to start up a D&D campaign. He had told me about this game before, and I was eager to see what it was all about. But listening to him try to explain it to me, and later a fellow player would also try as we're walking through the campus grounds, I'm just mentioning that now, I was only more confused. I didn't understand the concept of this game at all. It didn't sound like a game. I wasn't sure what it sounded like. All I got was there weren't any winners or losers, and the game never actually ends. Man, okay. None of that made any sense to me at all when talking about a game. How can a game not have an end, let alone any winners or losers? He said that you'd play an entire evening, and when you'd stop, the game didn't end. You'd simply pick up where you left off the next time everybody got together to play again. Of course, this just caused me more confusion. I had no clue what my friend was talking about as we were walking through the campus grounds. Well, basically, you play a character in the game. You could be a dwarf or an elf or a human, he said, and there were other races to choose from as well. And then there was your class, he'd continue. You could be a fighter or a ranger, a cleric or a paladin, a thief or a magic user. Paladins were really powerful, he said, while magic users sucked and were weak. Then why be a magic user, I asked. Because if you can survive, magic users tend to become the most powerful. The conversation continued, but I really wasn't following any of it. We basically fight monsters and find treasure, and when you do that, you gain what's called experience points. Once you get enough experience points, you go up a level. Again, I interrupted him. You realize I still have no clue what you're talking about, right? That's because I was thinking game like Monopoly or Stratego. Don't worry, he said. Once you start playing, it'll start to make sense. But I had my doubts. The DM describes what's happening, and we role play. Role play? I asked. You mean like acting? I'm no good at acting. I suck at acting. That doesn't sound like much fun. Don't worry, he reassured me. All you have to do is tell the DM what you're doing. To which I thought to myself, how will I know what I'm doing if I have no clue what I'm doing? I was so confused. This didn't sound like a game. This sounded like some drama group play rehearsal. It just sounded weird. But I decided to just go and see what happens. There were around 6 or 7 of us in our little dorm room. The DM was my roommate. He sat in the back and set up some boards that would serve as his table. Basically a board that ran from my desk to his desk, and he set another board on top of it on his left side that ran towards the back, creating a little cubicle-like setting for himself. We sat on the floor or the beds. It was time to roll up characters. They showed me some weird dice. One of them had 4 sides. One guy rolled the die and asked me if I knew which number came up. I looked at the pyramid-shaped die and said no. I had no clue. He showed me how to read the die. I was like, okay, so what? You've got weirdly shaped dice, and one of them, the 4-sided die, is hard to read. So what? I had no clue what I was doing or what was going on. But everybody was talking, and people were rolling dice, and they all had a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, and they were writing stuff on the paper as they rolled dice. They had me roll some 6-sided dice. You want to roll high, they said. Okay, I said, as if telling me that would somehow help me to roll high. I'd roll a 13, and they'd tell me to write 13 on the paper. That's your strength. That's kind of average, they said, which meant absolutely nothing to me. So write strength next to the number 13. Now roll again for your intelligence. So I rolled again. I rolled these dice many times. Apparently, I was allowed to roll a few times and take the highest roll for each of my abilities and then write them on what was called my character sheet. I remember some guy who wasn't playing was looking at the character sheets and commented about how high the rolls were. I remember someone saying how 18 was the highest roll you could get, and that some people had rolled some 18s along with some 17s and 16s, but there were definitely some lower numbers there too, like my 13 strength. This is not typical of a D&D character, he said. These characters are very much above average. He obviously knew what he was talking about, and I wondered what it all meant. But I noticed the DM didn't seem to mind what he was saying and basically ignored him. I wasn't sure if that meant anything either. I don't remember all the characters that were rolled up. Believe it or not, I don't even remember what my character was. Pretty pathetic, I know. But I know one guy had a dwarven fighter. He would be the group leader and did most of the talking and interacting with the DM. He had a great personality and was very jovial, and I enjoyed listening to him as he'd react to what was happening in the game as the DM would describe something. I remember the first time we fought some monsters, and afterwards he'd belt out, "Let's search the bodies!" I thought to myself, search the bodies? The dead bodies? Ew, gross. Why are we doing that? But some of those monsters had coins on them. Copper pieces, silver pieces, and sometimes even some gold pieces. The dwarf was always so happy when we found some money. "Yes," he'd say, "more money. Good, because we're going to need to get a lot of money to afford training." He'd then explain to us new players, there were a few, what training was, and how once one of our characters earned enough experience points to advance to the next level that they first had to pay for training, which he said usually cost around 1,500 gold pieces. 1,500 gold pieces, I thought to myself. How in the heck are we going to ever acquire so much money? But going up a level appeared to be a long ways off, and since I had no idea what I was doing, I didn't worry about it, let alone the fact that I had no clue what going up a level meant, let alone involved. The guy who played the dwarf really was fun, though. It was from him that I learned that kobolds are the scum of the dungeon. I've never forgotten that statement. There were many things he said as we played that I'd remember. "We're searching the bodies. Roll for initiative. We need to bind wounds." He clearly knew the lingo and had great communication skills. Without him, I doubt the game would have been nearly as fun. Here's another thing he'd often say. We'd be exploring a cave and we'd come to a door. "First, we're going to listen at the door. Do we hear anything?" he'd ask the DM. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. He was great at keeping the game moving, especially when some players looked bored and or were talking to each other about other things and weren't even paying attention. He was also great at getting our attention without telling us to shut up or get upset. He'd just talk and tell stories about some of his adventures he'd been on. Not the dwarf he was playing now, but from other games he'd played in. I didn't get it. Adventures he'd been on? He sounded like he was on those adventures, like they actually happened. I didn't follow half or more of what he was saying, but those who had played before really enjoyed the stories he was telling. I was mostly confused, but did my best to listen and try to understand as much as I could. But I was still clueless as to what was actually happening. I didn't fully get what we were doing, or how this was a game. It's funny, though, how I remember the characters that were being played, but not my own. All I can tell you is my head was clearly not in the game in the beginning, and I really wasn't all that interested at the start, which is probably why I have no clue what my character was. But my guess is I was a human fighter. That's what I think it was. I'm probably the only guy to play D&D who doesn't who doesn't remember his first character. But I do remember some of the other ones. Again, go figure. One guy played a magic user, but only because the DM said that we should have a magic user in our party. Someone played a cleric, same reason. Someone played a thief, and someone played a ranger. The guy who played the ranger was also an interesting player. I remember him going on and on about how much he liked this sword that was called a bastard sword. He would show me on his character sheet how the bastard sword was better than the typical longsword that most people used, because he got bonuses to hit with it. It was easier to hit a monster with it than a longsword, and how he could use two hands with it instead of one because it was a larger sword, and when he did that, he'd do more damage to the creature he was fighting against, but how in doing so he couldn't use his shield. I actually followed what he was saying. He gave up some defense to be able to do more damage. I remember once we were walking through a forest and the DM said an ogre came around a big tree he was hiding behind. The dwarf sounded scared. Ogres, he cried. No, they're like 10 feet tall. We should probably run. But the guy playing the ranger wanted to fight, so he attacked, even though the dwarf said we should run. Thus, the ranger said he was attacking the ogre, therefore he was attacking the ogre. I would learn that that's how D&D works. If you say you're doing or saying something, then that means you just did or said what you said you were going to do or say. How's that for a confusing sentence? Great, said the dwarf, sounding a bit worried. 10 feet tall, I thought to myself. We're being attacked by a giant 10-foot ogre. How exactly are we going to survive this? But the ranger hit him twice with his bastard sword, and the ogre fell to the ground. Yeah, cried the ranger. See what I mean? Bastard swords are great, he said. I was convinced. He put a notch on his character sheet every time he killed an ogre, and just so you all know, that happened maybe 3 times in the game, I think. Something like that. He was keeping score. But it wasn't some rule in the game that he was following. This was him role-playing. He was keeping track of his kills, all the while telling everyone how great bastard swords were. What his character was doing was actually putting notches in his sword for every ogre he killed. Pretty cool, I thought to myself. It was fun to listen to him. But, let me get that right. There we go. It was fun to listen to him. But what was even more fun was when the dwarf said, We searched the ogre for treasure. This should be good, he said. Ogres sometimes have a lot of money on them. And sure enough, he did. I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like double digits of copper and silver and even some gold. And the dwarf was just ecstatic. He would write the treasure down on his sheet, but the DM wanted to know who was carrying the treasure. We decided to divvy it up, so everybody took some for themselves. I remember the dwarf saying how we had to save all we could, again talking about needing money for training. I had no clue what I was doing. I was basically just sitting on the floor of our dorm room, listening to the guy who was playing the dwarf tell the DM what we were doing, and then hearing the DM describe what was happening, most of which I didn't really follow, and I would drift off at times, as the game would bog down, and even seem boring at times. Nothing was happening. People were just talking, but the next thing I knew, we had found some caves in the woods we were traveling through. The DM said there's a strange smell from the cave. Immediately the dwarf said, Uh-oh, let's back away. Let's not go in there. Made sense to me. Why go into a dark cave that has a funny smell? Eventually we found another cave, and when we entered, we were attacked by kobolds. Kobolds, the scum of the dungeon, the dwarf cried out. I had no clue what a kobold was, but he and the DM would describe them to us and even showed us a picture of what they looked like. Little 3-foot-tall creatures that were humanoid-looking, kind of like goblins, but smaller. I kind of saw why he referred to them as the scum of the dungeon. They kind of looked like dungeon scum. This game I was playing in is kind of hard to describe, especially as I think back 37 years ago to when I first played and what that experience was like. I'm sitting on the floor of our dorm room with several other people all sitting nearby. The DM is sitting in a chair using 2 boards that function as tables, and our game caller, the guy playing the dwarf, sat on the floor right below him. The DM always was checking for what our marching order was, and he'd write it down. Apparently, it was important to know who was in the front, the middle, and the back. When it was dark, he'd ask who was holding torches. All of this gear was on our character sheet. We had purchased these items in town at the start of the game, and when we'd use them, we'd have to mark them off. I remember the DM saying, everything is kept track of. Everything matters, even food. Yes, we kept track of our food that we carried with us, and every day that passed meant we had to check off 1 day's worth of food. It was all written down on our sheet, and at times the DM would ask to see one of our sheets. He sat behind cardboard screens, so I couldn't see what he was doing, but he usually appeared to be writing something down, like our marching order, for instance, and occasionally I'd hear him roll some dice. but I had no clue what he was doing or why he was doing it. Then there was combat. Whether an ogre came around a tree or we encountered kobolds or goblins in a cave we were exploring, combat would inevitably take place, and it was a most unique experience to watch it for the first time. Sometimes it was boring, but sometimes it was thrilling. The DM would tell us what and how many were attacking us, and then ask us what we were doing. The dwarf would help to determine who would engage the creatures and how many. I noticed that the DM usually distributed the monsters on each of the characters equally. I guessed that he was doing that for ease of play. Then there was this thing called initiative. "Roll for initiative," the dwarf cried out with a big smile on his face, excited to engage monsters in combat. The DM rolled some dice and said who won the initiative, us or the monsters. Whoever won got to attack first. The DM would then ask each player if they were doing something other than physically attacking one of the creatures with our weapon. Usually we just attacked, and the DM would roll a die and say, "You hit the goblin," or "You missed." Every time he said, "You hit," at least one person would say, "Yes," or "Did I kill him?" or something similar. The feeling that I was engaged with a group of people that were being attacked by monsters was becoming more and more real in my mind with each combat that we entered. Often I'd watch the DM roll dice, and I couldn't see what he rolled because it's behind screens, but I'd watch him roll dice, and he'd say something like, "All the goblins missed, roll initiative." But whenever a creature hit one of us, there was always tension. The DM would roll dice to see how much damage it did, and we'd all wait with bated breath to see if he survived the attack or not. Eventually, someone would fall from taking too much damage. They were reduced to 0 hit points or lower. Every player started with a certain amount of hit points, which was mostly determined by what kind of character you were playing. Fighters tended to have the most hit points, while magic users usually had the least. When someone would fall in battle, the dwarf would talk about how hopefully when we'd bind their wounds after combat ended, that hopefully they'd survive. So basically the character was unconscious, but would die unless we were successful at binding their wounds. I remember it involved the roll of a 4-sided dice, and if the roll didn't get the character back to 1 or more hit points, the character died. Amazingly, we kept avoiding death somehow. I would later learn that this was a very strict rule the DM was using, but he was probably also fudging the die rolls sometimes, because he probably didn't want characters dying all the time. But eventually someone did die, and then the dwarf would talk about how in order to bring the character back from the dead, we'd have to pay a high-level cleric to raise him from the dead, but that it would cost like 5,000 gold pieces, which we didn't have. But we could maybe pay over time or serve the cleric in some way to pay him back. It all sounded very strange and kind of dark and macabre, but I was quite intrigued at all of it as I listened to the guy who played the dwarf explain how it all worked and what our options were. I don't remember exactly what we did about our dead character. You'd think I'd remember that. I think he rolled up another character is what happened. But I was so interested in the combat and the monsters that we were encountering in the caves we were exploring that's the stuff I remember the most. Go figure. Okay, so let me explain the moment that would be etched in my mind forever, along with those moments that I've already described to you. I remember we were in the cave with the kobolds. Someone had fallen into a pit at one point, and then as we were about to engage some kobolds in battle, down the corridor to our left came a bunch of giant rats. The DM said you can't tell how many because it's kind of dark, but from what you can see, it's at least 10 rats. 10 rats? The dwarf cried. "We're in trouble. Maybe we should flee because we could all die." But then the guy who was playing the magic user spoke. "Wait, what about that fireball scroll I have?" "Ooh," said the dwarf, sounding all excited. "That could work, but when you try to cast it, it might not work." "Well, if it doesn't work," said the magic user, "then we'll run." Everyone agreed. "So how does this work?" he asked. This was his first time playing D&D too. We had found this scroll along with some treasure a little while ago, probably a couple hours ago in real time. I remember how excited everybody was when we found it. A scroll with a magic spell on it, Fireball. This was all happening in my mind. I was picturing us finding this scroll and the magic user opening it up and seeing this magical spell written in a language that only he could understand. I remember the guy who played the dwarf telling us how powerful a fireball spell was, that it was a third level spell. At the time, our magic user could only cast one first level spell, and then all he could do was throw his dagger at monsters and hide behind the other characters because he was the weakest member of the party. So he always tried to avoid having to engage a monster in melee. Also, he only had a few hit points and little to no protection, whereas fighters and clerics and even thieves could wear some form of armor, making it harder for monsters to hit them. But the magic user had nothing and was an easy target. It was then that I realized why my friend said, "Magic users suck." The dwarf continued, "Well, there's good news and there's bad news with trying to cast this. First, it might not work, because this is a higher level spell than you're capable of casting. But because it's on a scroll, there's a pretty good chance you'll succeed at it. And if you do, it could wipe out all the rats. Now imagine in reality we're all having this conversation in a dungeon while being attacked by kobolds, and at least 10 giant rats are running towards us from another corridor." That last line about killing all the giant rats made the magic user excited. "Oh, I'm so going to try to cast a fireball spell," he said. "Wait," said the dwarf. "There's a tiny chance it could backfire and blow up in your face." Everybody kind of laughed and was like, "Oh no," but the magic user was determined. "Don't care. I'm going to take the chance." "Okay," said the DM. He then was looking through some stuff, apparently determining the odds of this working or not working or blowing up in the magic user's face. The dwarf then added, "Oh, if this works, you're going to get a lot of experience points too," and explained how anytime someone successfully casts a scroll from a spell, that they get a lot of experience for it, which only excited us all the more. "The fireball goes off," said the DM. Excitement filled the air. "This should probably kill all of them," said the dwarf. And it did. "They're all dead," said the DM. And when the magic user heard that, he let out a wail. In the dorm room, he let out a wail. It was wild. Chills ran through my body. In my mind, I saw it happen. I saw this magic user who barely knew what he was doing, because this is the first time playing for him too, who up until now would cast one spell and then couldn't cast any more until we rested for several hours, and all he did was hide behind the other characters and throw his dagger at a monster, keeping a safe distance. But now he just successfully cast this unbelievably powerful spell that he had no knowledge how to cast. But because he was a magic user, he was able to succeed at casting it. And I saw, in my mind, the fireball go off, killing all the giant rats. Followed by everyone cheering. I went from thinking we were all going to die to wondering if we'd try to run away to seeing a fireball explode down a corridor. I had never experienced a game like this. It was thrilling. That evening, playing D&D in our dorm room, we would encounter orcs, humanoid creatures with faces like pigs, goblins, hobgoblins, bigger, tougher goblins, bugbears, large 7-foot-tall humanoid creatures that kind of looked like a bear, but it walked on 2 legs upright, and other creatures too, that I don't completely remember. We ended our gaming session well past midnight, but it was Friday night, so it didn't matter. We ended by heading back to the keep, the castle, where we would rest up and buy more supplies. It was a good place to stop the game until we could all get together again to continue where we left off. And it was probably around 3 a.m. That night when I tried to sleep, all I could think about was getting back to those orcs that we just encountered. I couldn't wait to see what treasure we'd find. I couldn't wait to see what else we'd encounter. I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to engage them in battle. My dreams were filled with all these creatures, with adventure. I was traveling with a party through a forest, through a cave, through a town, and we had weapons and armor. Some of us had magical powers, and we were doing it because we wanted to slay the evil monsters that were terrorizing the land, and we wanted to find treasure and magic and gold, and we wanted fame and glory and power. It was a wonderful experience. But here's the best part. I didn't know the rules. I didn't need to. All I needed was an active imagination, which I had plenty of. The whole game took place in my mind, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Through the years, I would learn all of the rules and the mechanics of the game, and part of me is actually sad that I did. Because with all those rules and game mechanics that I learned, I also lost some of the magic that was Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. What made me fall in love with the game was how I felt like I was actually there, exploring dungeons, walking through a forest, entering a village, and talking with the locals. That's what Dungeons. That's what Dungeons and Dragons is. That's why it's such a great game, because it takes you to a place of fantasy where you get to partake in a marvelous adventure. It takes you to a place where you can become a great warrior or wizard, cleric or rogue. You can become a powerful ranger or fighter, a lord, and slay powerful monsters as you wield powerful weapons in battle. You can become a powerful cleric, a high priest, and destroy undead creatures with your holy symbol, and cast healing spells, and even raise the dead back to life. You can become a powerful magic user, a wizard, and amass a wealth of magical spells that are all at your disposal. Spells of great power, which you can wield not only to slay monsters, but for many other tasks too. You can become a powerful rogue, a master thief who's able to disappear into the shadows while you skulk around and slay monsters without them even knowing you were there. You can pick pockets, open locks, find traps, and even learn how to wield magic through the use of scrolls, let alone do incredible damage to monsters as you attack them from behind. Dungeons and Dragons isn't a game about rules and abilities. It's a game about adventures. It's a game about adventures that you, wow. It's a game about adventures that you and your friends go on together, where you slay all manner of incredible monsters and find all manner of incredible treasures, all the while acquiring more and more power as you go. It is a magical game that never ends and is only limited by your imagination and that of the dungeon master. Let me say that again. It is a magical game that never ends and is only limited by your imagination and that of the dungeon master. Dungeons and Dragons is about fantasy. It's about adventure. Everything else is just a bunch of rules that mostly don't matter.